Welcome to Tractus Maximus, the Neurology podcast with a special focus on neuromuscular neurology, from the molecular level to clinical presentations and clinical applications. In this foundational episode, we will dig deep into the molecular infrastructure of the skeletal muscle as a background to the clinical syndromes that we shall explore in future episodes. I am your host, Dr. David Ajibe, a neurologist based in the UK. Let's get into it.
I'd like to have a calm discussion on this topic. You think we can manage that?
About 40% of the human body is skeletal muscle, and perhaps another 10% is smooth and cardiac muscle. Some of the basic principles of contraction apply to all these different types of muscle. However, in this podcast, we will focus on skeletal muscle as it is the most relevant one for neurologists. Skeletal muscle is a voluntary striated tissue innervated by lower motor neurons originating in the anterior horn of the spinal cord or cranial nerve motor nuclei. The skeletal muscle is crucial for voluntary movement, posture, joint stability, and breathing, but also serves vital metabolic roles like glucose regulation, nutrient storage, and heat generation, impacting overall health and protecting organs, with disorders leading to significant disability. Functionally, skeletal muscle converts neural electrical signals into mechanical force. Any disruption along this axis, from the motor neuron to the contractile apparatus, results in weakness, fatigability, or abnormal tone. For neurologists, the skeletal muscle is not merely a target organ. It is a diagnostic canvas reflecting disorders of the motor neuron, the neuromuscular junction, and the muscle fiber itself. Understanding skeletal muscle at the cellular level sharpens clinical reasoning, guides interpretation of EMG and biopsy findings, and deepens insight into neuromuscular disease mechanisms. Let's explore this segment by segment.
At my signal, unleash hell.
Segment 1. The architecture. Why its structure predicts disease. Every skeletal muscle is made of individual muscle fibers, 10 to 80 micrometers in diameter, each running the full length of the muscle. Here's the anatomical fact that underpins all of neurology. Each fiber is innervated by exactly one nerve ending sitting near the fiber's midpoint, one lower motor neuron, one end plate. This is why when you stick a needle into a muscle on EMG and see denervation changes, those changes are geographically precise. They map to specific nerve territories because the wiring is one-to-one. The outer membrane of the fiber, the sarcolemma, is a plasma membrane, plus an outer polysaccharide coat with embedded collagen fibrils. At the ends, the sarcolemma fuses with tendon fibers that bundle and insert into bone. This is where contractile force becomes mechanical movement. Think of the sarcolemma as both the electrical, excitable surface and the structural handshake between chemistry and mechanics. Inside each fiber, there are hundreds to thousands of myofibrils. Each myofibril contains approximately 1,500 thick filaments or myosin and 3,000 thin filaments or actin. Their partial overlap creates the alternating light and dark bands you see under light microscopy. The light bands, or I bands, standing for isotropic, contain only actin. The dark bands, or A bands, standing for anisotropic, contain myosin plus overlapping actin. Projecting from the myosin into the actin lattice are cross bridges, the actual force generators. This is a molecular handshake that makes movement happen. Actin filaments anchor at Z discs. The region between two Z discs is one sarcomere, the fundamental contractile unit. At the optimal resting sarcomere length of approximately 2 micrometers, actin mass in overlap is ideal and force generation is maximal. This length-tension relationship matters clinically. We'll talk more on this later.
Clinical pearl. Dystrophinopathies. Without dystrophin anchoring the intracellular actin cytoskeleton to the extracellular matrix, every contraction cycle tears the sarcolemma. The muscle injures itself every time it fires. That's why DMD shows elevated CK, contraction-induced necrosis, and calf pseudo-hypertrophy from fibrous replacement. We'll go deep on dystrophinopathies, genetics, phenotype spectrum, and emerging therapies in a dedicated episode.
Strength and honor. Strength and honor. Strength and honor.
Segment 2. Sarcoplasm, sarcoplasmic reticulum or SR, and titin, the hidden infrastructure. Myofills don't float in nothing. They are suspended in the sarcoplasm, the muscle fibers, intracellular fluid rich in potassium, magnesium, phosphate, enzymes, and densely packed mitochondria lying in parallel rows alongside the myofibrils. Think of the mitochondria as the batteries sitting directly next to the motors that power. Mitochondrial density reflects oxidative capacity, and when mitochondria are dysfunctional, the motor keeps trying to run on flat batteries. This is the story of mitochondrial myopathy. Surrounding every myofibril is a sarcoplasmic reticulum, an elaborate internal membrane network that is entirely dedicated to calcium management. When the muscle needs to contract, release calcium. When it needs to relax, pump it back. The pump is SERCA, which is sarcoplasmic endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase. Fast twitch fibers have especially elaborate SR networks precisely because they need to relax quickly as well as contract quickly. If SERCA fails, the muscle stays contracted. You meet this exact scenario in a patient who can't open their hands after gripping, but more on that shortly. And then there's titin, a protein of approximately 3 million molecular weight, one of the largest proteins in the human body. It opens the half sarcomere from Z disc to M line, acting as a molecular spring that keeps myosin and actin in their precise geometric relationship. Titin also provides passive stiffness to the stretched sarcomere. Mutations cause titinopathies, a clinically variable group including tibial muscular dystrophy or OOD myopathy, and early onset myopathy with fatal cardiomyopathy. This is worth knowing because a cardiac involvement can be the killer even when the skeletal muscle disease appears mild.
Clinical pearl, Brody disease, ATP2A1 mutations, knockout SERCA1, so calcium can't be cleared and the muscle stays contracted after exercise. The key bedside trick, it looks like myotonia, but the EMG is electrically silent, membrane normal, calcium stuck. Channelopathies and calcium disorders get their own episode. This is just the teaser.
Segment 3. The Neuromuscular Cascade. 8 steps, 8 disease targets. Here's how I want you to think about this cascade. Every single step is either a disease site, a drug target, or a diagnostic discriminator. Don't just memorize the sequence. Understand what breaks at each point and what the clinical consequence is. Step 1. Action potential travels down the alpha motor neuron axon. This is your lower motor neuron. Motor neuron disease, spinal muscular atrophy, motor neuropathies all attack here. Clinically, there is weakness, wasting, fasciculations, reduced reflexes, your typical lower motor neuron pattern. Step 2. The action potential triggers presynaptic calcium influx via P/Q type voltage-gated calcium channels or calcium 2.1, which drives acetylcholine vesicle fusion and ACH release into the synaptic cleft. This is the step Lambert-Eaton myasthenic syndrome (LEMS) attacks. Antibodies against calcium 2.1 reduce quantal ACH release, less calcium in, fewer vesicles fuse, less ACH out. This is precisely why repetitive stimulation augments CMAP amplitude in LEMS. Cumulative calcium builds up in the terminal with each stimulus, partially rescuing release. Step 3. ACH binds postsynaptic nicotinic ACH receptors, ligand-gated cation channels, opening the pore. Step 4. Sodium rushes in, generating the end plate potential. If large enough, it triggers a muscle fiber action potential. In myasthenia gravis, anti-ACHR or anti-MuSK antibodies reduce functional receptor density. The end plate potential is smaller, sometimes below threshold. This is a decremental response on 3 Hz repetitive stimulation. Progressive depletion of ACH stores meets reduced receptor density and transmission fails. At 3 Hz, you can watch it happen in real time on your NCS screen. That is decremental Ohm's law of the neuromuscular junction. Step 5. The muscle fiber action potential propagates bidirectionally along the sarcolemma from the end plate, exactly like an axon, same sodium channel mechanics, same all or nothing kinetics. In step 6, T-tubules carry the electrical signal deep into the fiber, reaching the triad junctions where dihydropyridine receptor calcium 1.1 couples physically with rhinodie receptor on the sarcoplasmic reticulum terminal cisternae. The dihydropyridine receptor acts as a voltage sensor. Its conformational change directly gates the rhinodine receptor to release calcium. This is where malignant hypothermia lives. Gain of function rhinodine receptor mutations make the receptor hair trigger sensitive. Add a volatile anesthetic or succinylcholine and you get uncontrolled calcium release, uncontrolled cross-bridge cycling, ATP consumption, heat generation, acidosis, and a patient dying on the table if you don't recognize it fast. Step 7. Free calcium rises from approximately 100 nanometers to approximately 10 micrometers around the myofibrils, activating the troponin-tropomyosin complex and permitting cross-bridge cycling. Contraction then proceeds. Step 8. Circa pumps calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum lumen. Calcium falls. Troponin C releases calcium. Tropomyosin recovers the active sites. Cross-bridge cycling stops and then relaxation occurs. Dantrolene blocks rhinodine receptor, preventing step 6. It is the antidote for malignant hypothermia and neuroleptic malignant syndrome.
They're coming in hot. Any second. What's the play?
Well, we want to take the high ground, okay? So let's put the biggest gun up on that ridge.
Gotcha. Where do you want to be?
Where are you going?
What are you talking about?
I
You have a big gun. You are not the big gun.
Tony, don't be jealous.
No, it's subtle, all the bells and whistles.
Yeah, it's called being a badass.
Segment 4. Sliding filaments, the mechanism behind the movement. Here's a core concept. The sliding filament mechanism. In the relaxed sarcomere, actin filaments from opposing Z discs barely overlap each other. When contraction is triggered, actin slides inward, deeper into the myosin lattice, dragging the Z discs towards each other. The sarcomere shortens. The critical insight: neither the myosin filament nor the actin filament changes length. They just change how much they overlap. This was proven in the 90s by Andrew and Hugh Huxley independently, one of the great moments in cell biology, and they did this by watching sarcomere bands under phase contrast microscopy during controlled contraction. The force comes from the cross bridges. Myosin heads reach out, bind actin, undergo a conformational change, pull the actin filament. ATP hydrolysis resets the head. This is a cycle. And it is important for you to know, in pathological states where ATP production is impaired, such as mitochondrial disease, glycogen storage disorders, prolonged ischemia, the crossbridge cycle is the first victim at high demand. The patients get exercise intolerance, cramps, myalgia, not because the nerve is sick, but because the engine is running out of fuel. The filaments slide, the cross bridges cycle, pathology interrupts the cycle, and your job is to figure out where.
Oh, you want to play? Come on.
Segment 5. Myosin, the force engine and its genetic diseases. The myosin filament is built from approximately 200 or more individual myosin molecules, each approximately 480,000 Daltons. Each myosin molecule is a hexamer, 2 heavy chains approximately 200,000 Daltons each, and 4 light chains approximately 20,000 Daltons each. The 2 heavy chains coil around each other, coil rod, forming the filament tail. At one end, each heavy chain folds into a globular myosin head, 2 heads per molecule. These heads are your force generators. Each head is connected to the filament body via an extended arm with 2 flexible hinges, one at the arm body junction, one at the head arm junction. This is why cross bridges are mechanically versatile. The hinges allow the head to swing far outward or pull close depending on the phase of the contraction cycle. The whole filament is helically twisted, so each successive cross-bridge pair is displaced 120 degrees from the last, ensuring cross bridges radiate in all directions. Total filament length, approximately 1.6 micrometers. Invariant. The central bare zone, approximately 0.2 micrometers, has no cross-bridge heads. The geometry of hinge arms simply doesn't allow them to face inward towards the center. What is the most critical property of the myosin head? It is an ATPase enzyme. It binds and hydrolyzes ATP. This ATPase activity is not just about providing energy. It is the mechanochemical transducer that converts phosphate bond energy into mechanical force. Without ATPase, no cross-bridge cycle. Without cross-bridge cycle, no contraction. This is why drugs targeting myosin ATPase are being trialed in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Mavacamten is a myosin inhibitor that reduces hypercontractility by directly damping the ATPase cycle.
A little fight now. I like that.
Segment 6. Actin, tropomyosin, and troponin, the regulatory switch. The thin filament is a 3-protein system: actin, tropomyosin, and troponin. The backbone is F-actin, a double-stranded helix of polymerized G-actin monomers, approximately 42,000 Daltons each with one bound ADP molecule. Those ADP-bound sites are the active sites, where myosin cross-bridges bind to drive contraction. They are staggered every 2.5 nanometers. The filament is approximately 1 micrometer long, anchored firmly into the Z disc, 3 ends projecting into myosin lattice. Tropomyosin, 70,000 Daltons, 40 nanometers long, lies as a continuous strand in the groove of the F-actin helix. In resting conditions, it physically covers the active sites. This is the off switch. The muscle is constitutively inhibited. Myosin cannot bind, no calcium, no contraction. That's the default state, which makes sense. You don't want muscles firing randomly. The master regulator is a troponin complex, 3 subunits attached at intervals along the tropomyosin. Troponin T anchors the complex to tropomyosin. Troponin I suppresses ATPase activity and stabilizes the inhibited state. it's the brake. Troponin C is a calcium sensor, binding up to 4 calcium ions. When calcium floods in from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it binds troponin C, which undergoes a conformational change that relieves troponin I's inhibitory grip on actin, allowing tropomyosin to shift approximately 1 nanometer deeper into the actin groove, and the sites open. That 1 nanometer shift is all it takes. The gate opens and 200 cross-bridge heads come flooding in. By the way, troponin I and troponin T are the cardiac isoforms you measure in the blood when a patient has a myocardial infarction. The same proteins, different isoforms, different tissue expression. When myocytes die, they leak cardiac troponin I and cardiac troponin T. Now you know exactly what these proteins actually do when they are alive and working.
I think I got it, but just in case, tell me the whole thing again. I wasn't listening.
Segment 7. The cross-bridge cycle. 6 steps, 0 shortcuts. This is a mechanism. The walk-along ratchet. 6 steps. I want you to understand each one well enough to explain what goes on at each. Step 1. Pre-stroke. ATP primes the spring. The myosin head binds ATP. The ATPase immediately cleaves it to ADP plus pi, but both products stay bound. This hydrolysis mechanically cocks the head into its high-energy perpendicular orientation. It is extended toward actin, poised but not yet attached. Think of it as a loaded mousetrap. The energy is stored in the conformation of the protein itself. Step 2. Calcium opens the active site. When the sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium floods in and troponin C is occupied, tropomyosin shifts and the active sites open. The cocked head makes initial contact with the actin active site. Weak, electrostatic, rapidly reversible at first. Step 3. Power stroke. Pi release triggers this. Inorganic phosphate leaves the head. This triggers a transition to the strong binding state, and the head swings through approximately 70 degrees, tilting toward the arm. The actin filament is dragged along. Force generated, approximately 3 to 5 piconewtons. Displacement, approximately 5 to 10 nanometers per stroke. This is the power stroke. The energy driving this movement came from the ATP hydrolysis in step 1, not from the binding, not from the phosphate release. The release is just a trigger. The energy was already there, stored. Step 4. ADP release. The rigor state. ADP dissociates from the head. The head is now in rigor configuration, tightly bound to actin, no nucleotide in the active site, unable to release or generate another stroke. This state has a name you already know from forensics. Rigor mortis is step 4 permanently. Step 5. New ATP binding, detachment. A fresh ATP molecule binds the rigor head, dramatically reducing its affinity for actin. The head detaches, no ATP available, no detachment. The cross-bridge stays locked. This is why ATP depletion causes contracture, not just weakness, but rigid, mechanical stiffness that no drug can relax. Step 6. Recocking. The new ATP is hydrolyzed, recocking the head to its perpendicular state. If calcium is still elevated and active sites are still accessible, the cycle repeats immediately at a new position further along the actin filament. Each cycle advances the filament approximately 5 to 10 nanometers. Hundreds of cross bridges cycling asynchronously produce smooth, continuous graded force.
Strength and honor. Strength and honor. Strength and honor.
Segment 8. Length tension and force velocity, the mechanical reality. The force a muscle generates is not fixed. It depends on its current length and how fast it's shortening. These aren't academic curves. They govern what you see at the bedside every time you test power. Length tension. At a sarcomere length of 2 to 2.2 micrometers, actin-myosin overlap is optimal. Maximum cross bridge is available. Maximum active tension. Shorten below 2 micrometers and actin filaments from opposite Z discs start overlapping each other, interfering with cross bridge access. Force drops. At 1.65 micrometers, the Z disc hits the myosin filament head. Jam. At 3.6 micrometers, sarcomere length going the other way, 0 overlap, 0 active tension. In whole muscle, passive connective tissue generates additional tension on stretch, so total force has a second hump. Clinically relevant in spasticity, where passive stiffness from shortened muscle architecture adds to the neurohyperexcitability. Force velocity. 0 load leads to fastest contraction, reaching full shortening in approximately 0.1 seconds for the average muscle. Increasing load leads to decreasing velocity hyperbolically. This is the Hill's equation. At maximum load, velocity is 0. The muscle activates fully and generates force but cannot shorten. This is isometric contraction. When you assess power against resistance, you are exploring this curve. When spasticity increases velocity-dependent resistance, you are seeing the force-velocity relationship warped by tonic alpha motor neuron overactivity, different from true weakness, and treatable through different mechanisms.
You're not playing the odds, friend.
Segment 9. Energetics. 3 systems, 3 timescales, 3 disease patterns. Let's go. Muscle contraction consumes ATP at 2 joints in the cross-bridge cycle. Hydrolysis to prime the power stroke and binding to detach the rigor head. Circa also needs ATP to pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sodium potassium ATPase needs it to restore membrane gradients. Add it all up, the resting myoplastic ATP concentration of approximately 4 millimolar sustains maximal contraction for exactly 1 to 2 seconds. 3 resynthesis systems take over in sequence, and each system, when it fails, produces a distinct clinical pattern you will recognize in patients. System 1, phosphocreatine, the 5 to 8 second sprint buffer. The creatine kinase reaction is near instantaneous. No oxygen needed, no enzymatic pathway to rate limit it. Phosphocreatine stores in muscle are approximately 5 times the ATP concentration. Combined, they sustain maximal contraction for only 5 to 8 seconds. After that, this system is dry. Side note, this is why the 5-second maximum voluntary contraction used in EMG to assess CMAP amplitude is physiologically timed. You're looking at a near maximal phosphocreatine-driven effort. System 2, anaerobic glycolysis, the 60-second reserve. Glycogen is broken down to pyruvate and lactate, regenerating ATP without oxygen at a rate approximately 2.5 times faster than oxidative phosphorylation can manage. Sustainable for up to a minute before accumulated lactate and hydride impair contractile function. This is your workhorse for high-intensity bursts. When it fails, as in Mercado disease, the patient cramps with moderate intensity exercise, cannot break down glycogen to fuel anaerobic metabolism, gets a flat venous lactate on the forearm exercise test, and may develop myoglobinuria. The second wind phenomenon is pathognomonic, pain and stiffness at 5 to 10 minutes of moderate exercise, then relief as circulating free fatty acids and blood glucose finally become available to feed oxidative metabolism instead. System 3. Oxidative metabolism, the marathon engine. Mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation. Binding oxygen with metabolic substrates to drive ATP synthase accounts for more than 95% of all energy for sustained long-term contraction. In the substrate hierarchy, fat dominates over many hours. Carbohydrate can supply up to half for sustained 2 to 4 hour efforts. When this system fails, like in mitochondrial myopathies, you get exercise intolerance with disproportionately elevated lactate, ragged red fibers or Montgomery trichome. These are proliferating subsarcolemmal mitochondria trying to compensate, and cyclooxygenase deficient fibers on histochemistry. The overall mechanical efficiency of muscle is less than 25%. About half the energy in foodstuffs is lost during ATP synthesis. Only 40 to 45% of ATP energy is converted to work. The rest is heat. Physiologically useful for thermoregulation, catastrophic in malignant hypothermia, where uncontrolled cross-bridge cycling generates heat faster than any physiological dissipation mechanism can handle.
Come on, buddy, we're not out of this yet.
Segment 10. Muscle fiber types, the two-speed engine and why it breaks differently. Every muscle in your body is a mixture, not one uniform tissue. A carefully tuned blend of fibers with fundamentally different metabolic strategies, mechanical properties, and vulnerabilities. Understanding fiber types is what lets you predict which muscles fail first in a given disease, why some myopathies prefer proximal over distal, and why the biopsy pattern tells you as much about the pathological process as a clinical exam does. The classical division is type 1 versus type 2, but really, this is more nuanced. Type 1 fibers, slow twitch, oxidative, are built for endurance. They are smaller in diameter, contract slowly, and are highly resistant to fatigue. They achieve this through a dense mitochondrial network, an extensive capillary supply, and large stores of myoglobin, the intracellular oxygen-binding protein that gives them their characteristic deep red color on fresh tissue. The dominant mass in heavy chain isoform is beta MYHC or MYH7, a slow ATPase hydrolyzing ATP at a leisurely rate that matches sustained aerobic oxidative phosphorylation. Type 1 fibers are your postural muscles, your soleus, your diaphragm, anything that has to fire continuously for hours without failure. Type 2 fibers come in subtypes. Type 2A, fast-twitch oxidative glycolytic, are intermediate, fast contracting, but with meaningful oxidative capacity. They express 2A MYHC or MYH2, have moderate mitochondrial density, and fatigue at an intermediate rate. Type 2B/2X, fast-twitch glycolytic, are the sprinters. They express 2 or MYH1 in humans. They have few mitochondria, rely almost entirely on anaerobic glycolysis, generate enormous force very rapidly, and fatigue within seconds. They are pale white muscle because myoglobin is minimal. The mechanical differences are stark. Type 2 fibers contract approximately 3 to 5 times faster than type 1. They also relax faster. Their sarcoplasmic reticula are far more extensive with greater circuit density, so calcium is cleared rapidly after each twitch. This is why an ocular muscle can fire at 100 plus hertz, and a sprinter's gastrocnemius can generate explosive force, but neither can sustain it. Flip side, the soleus can hold postural tone for 16 hours a day indefinitely, but it will never win a sprint. Fiber type is not fixed, it is determined and continuously influenced by trophic signals from the motor neuron innervating it, and by the pattern of use. Slow, tonic neuron firing drives type 1 characteristics. Fast, phasic high-frequency firing drives type 2. This neurotrophism is a biological bias of cross-innervation experiments where a fast muscle re-innervated by a slow motor nerve gradually converts to a slow twitch properties over weeks and vice versa. It is also why endurance athletes progressively shift towards type 1 composition and why immobility or detraining shift the balance towards type 2X. The fiber type is listening to its neuron, and its neuron is listening to the pattern of use. On standard muscle biopsy with myosin ATPase histochemistry at pH 9.4, type 2 fibers stain dark and type 1 fibers stain pale. The classic checkerboard. Reverse the pH to 4.3 and the staining inverts. Understanding this reversal is important because some labs use it to confirm fiber identification. In normal muscle, the random intermixing of types reflects the fact that each motor unit's fibers are scattered throughout the muscle belly. No two adjacent fibers necessarily belong to the same unit. This architecture smooths force output and ensures no focal region exhausts preferentially. The relative proportion of fiber types varies dramatically between muscles and between individuals. The soleus in most people is roughly 70 to 80% type 1. The orbicularis oculi is predominantly type 2, fast, precise. Elite marathon runners may have soleus compositions exceeding 90% type 1. Elite sprinters skew the opposite way. Genetics set the ceiling. Training modulates within it, and critically for neurology, different diseases attack different fiber populations preferentially. Type 1 fiber predominance. More slow fibers than expected for a given muscle is a non-specific finding on biopsy, but it's seen in congenital myopathies, including Nemeline myopathy, central core disease, and myotubular myopathy. Some authorities believe it represents a maturational arrest. Fetal muscle is predominantly type 1, and failure to fully mature leaves the type 1 phenotype overrepresented. Type 1 fiber atrophy, specifically small, atrophied slow fibers with relatively preserved type 2 fibers, is characteristic of myotonic dystrophy type 1. This is one of the reasons DM1 patients have the distinctive pattern of facial and distal weakness as they do. The muscles richest in type 1 fibers, that is the facial, finger flexors, and ankle dorsiflexors, are the ones that atrophy earliest. Type 2 fiber atrophy, selectively small fast fibers with preserved slow fibers, has a completely different differential. This is a classic biopsy finding in steroid myopathy, disuse atrophy, and cachexia. Glucocorticoids preferentially suppress protein synthesis in type 2 fibers via inhibition of IGF-1/mTOR signaling. This is why patients on long-term steroids develop proximal weakness. The large, fast twitch fibers of the proximal muscles are the ones selectively wasting. Importantly, steroid myopathy produces no EMG abnormality and a normal CK. The diagnosis is almost entirely histological. If you see clean type 2B atrophy on biopsy in a proximal weak patient on steroids, you have your answer, and you need to taper, not add immunosuppression. One more fiber type worth knowing, type 2C fibers, co-expressing multiple myosin heavy chain isoforms, transitional phenotype. They are rare in healthy adult muscle but appear in large numbers during reinnervation and regeneration. Their presence in significant quantity on biopsy signals active remodeling. The muscle is in the middle of changing its fiber type in response to a change in neural drive. Think of them as a fiber type equivalent of a stem cell caught mid-differentiation. Segment 11. Multi-unit.
Almost there.
Summation on your EMG, the full picture. Let's zoom out to whole muscle physiology because this is where the basic science plugs directly into your daily EMG practice. The multi-unit, one alpha motor neuron plus every single muscle fiber it innervates. Multi-unit size is inversely proportional to precision of control required. Extraocular muscles and intrinsic hand muscles, 2 to 3 fibers per unit. That is why you can thread a needle and why MG-related diplopia is so precise and variable. Gastrocnemius, several hundred fibers per unit. Soleils, hundreds more. The average across all muscles is 80 to 100 fibers. The ratio is exactly what changes in reinnervation. Surviving axons sprout collaterals to adopt orphan fibers, creating enlarged motor units with broader territory and reduced fidelity. Normal muscle biopsy AT-PACE histochemistry shows a random checkerboard of type 1 slow, oxidative, fast resistant, and type 2 fast, glycolytic, fatigable fibers. Why random? Because each motor unit's fibers are scattered across the muscle belly, intermixed with fibers from other units. Fiber type grouping, where large clusters of the same type appear, occurs when reinnervation converts scattered denervated fibers to the same type as a sprouting neuron. It is the biopsy signature of all denervation with partial recovery. Force grading uses two mechanisms simultaneously: multiple fiber summation. Smaller motor units fire first as drive increases. This is the Henneman's size principle. Because small motor neurons have higher input resistance and therefore lower firing thresholds, as you need more force, progressively large units are recruited. Frequency summation. As firing rate increases, successive twitches stack. The second contraction begins before the first has fully relaxed, adding to it. At a critical frequency, contractions fuse into smooth maximal tetanization. At this point, sarcoplasmic calcium is maintained continuously between action potentials. Circa can't clear it, and every available cross bridge is cycling. Maximum tetanic force at optimal length is approximately 3 to 4 kilograms per centimeter squared. Scale that up to a 16-inch squared quadriceps belly, and you get up to 800 pounds of tension at the patellar tendon. This is why tendons avulse and why the combination of fluoroquinolone weakened collagen plus a single explosive movement can rupture a healthy Achilles tendon in an otherwise well patient. The staircase effect, otherwise known as trepe. The first few contractions of a rested muscle are weaker, then force builds over 10 to 15 twitches to plateau. Mechanism is this: calcium accumulates in the myoplasm faster than circa can clear it, so free calcium rises incrementally with successive action potentials, activating progressively more troponin C. This is normal physiology. Now flip it. The post-tetanic facilitation you see in Lambert-Eaton's myasthenic syndrome on repetitive nerve stimulation at high frequency is a neuromuscular junction analog. Cumulative presynaptic calcium builds up, more ACH vesicles fuse, CMAP amplitude climbs. If you understand trepe, you understand LEMS facilitation. Resting muscle tone is not passive. It requires continuous neural input. Skeletal muscle fibers do not contract without action potentials. Baseline tone is a tonic low frequency discharge from spinal alpha motor neurons modulated by supraspinal drive and proprioceptive feedback from muscle spindles, the A afferents. In upper motor neuron lesions, Loss of cortical inhibition over spinal interneurons disinhibit alpha motor neurons, resulting in spasticity. The muscle is receiving more neural input than it should, not less. The treatment targets the neural side, for example, using baclofen, tizanidine, botulinum toxin, and not the muscle directly. Muscle fatigue correlates directly with glycogen depletion rate in high-intensity sustained effort. Neuromuscular junction transmission also fatigues, normally a small physiological decrement. In myasthenia gravis, the safety factor of the neuromuscular junction transmission is already reduced by antibody-mediated receptor loss. Physiological fatigue pushes it over the threshold. The decremental response on 3 Hz repetitive stimulation in myasthenia gravis is the physiological decrement amplified by a diseased neuromuscular junction. And when blood flow is interrupted, near complete fatigue within 1 to 2 minutes, the energy clock runs out.
Put that hand on me again, you won't get it back.
Segment 12. Remodeling, Denervation, Hypertrophy, and Rigor. The long game. Muscle is not a static tissue. It is continuously remodeled. Diameters, lengths, fiber type composition, vascular density, contractile protein expression, all adapting to demand. The speed of this adaptation is surprising. In some active muscles, contractile proteins are fully turned over within 2 weeks. This is both the hope of rehabilitation and the explanation for why a week of bed rest in a hospitalized patient produces measurable atrophy and weakness that takes weeks to recover. Immobility is a clinical insult, not a neural state. Muscle hypertrophy. Increased mass happens almost entirely through an increase in the number of actin and myosin filaments per fiber. Individual fiber hypertrophy. The trigger is mechanical load during active contraction. Passive stretch does not do it. A few loaded contractions per day drive significant hypertrophy within 6 to 10 weeks. Filament counts can increase by 50%. This is the mechanistic rationale for resistance exercise in rehabilitation. You are telling the muscle to build more contractile apparatus. In neuromuscular diseases where the muscle can still respond, certain limb girdle muscular dystrophies, inflammatory myopathies in remission, post-polio, this principle guides the exercise prescription. Muscle atrophy, disuse or denervation tips the balance from synthesis to degradation. Denervation atrophy begins almost immediately. Degenerative changes appear in the fibers within 2 months. If the nerve supply regenerates quickly, fully functional recovery within 3 months is possible. But there is a hard deadline. After 1 to 2 years of denervation, no further functional recovery is possible. The muscle has been permanently replaced. This is why the timing of nerve repair surgery in traumatic nerve injuries is essential. Every month of delay is a month closer to irreversibility. Your EMG surveillance in recovering nerve injuries is not academic. It determines whether a surgeon re-explores. After prolonged denervation, fibers are replaced by fibrous and fatty tissue. What remains is a membrane housing nuclei with no contractile apparatus and no capacity to regenerate myofibrils, even if a nerve eventually arrives. The fibrous scar tissue tends to shorten progressively, and this is known as contracture. Physical therapy, daily stretching, splitting is not optional in denervated limbs. It is damage control. Fixed contractures become orthopedic problems that outlast the neurological ones. In poliomyelitis, partial lower motor neuron destruction leaves surviving motor axons to sprout collaterals, adopting paralyzed fibers and forming enlarged macromotor units up to 5 times normal size. Strength returns, but this comes at a cost. These enlarged units are operating near their physiological ceiling and have little reserve. Decades later, as normal age-related motor neuron attrition, approximately 1% per year from the fifth decade, continues, the macromotor units begin to fail. Too few neurons carrying too many fibers, and the compensatory capacity is fully exceeded. This is post-polio syndrome, new weakness, fatigue, pain, decades after an apparently resolved illness, no new infection, no treatment beyond pacing and orthotic support. And we end here where all physiology ends, with death, rigor mortis.
Don't die on me, Bob.
A few hours post-mortem, all muscles enter contracture, no electrical activity, no ATP. The cross bridges lock in rigor state, step 4 of the cycle permanently, no weakness, no flaccidity, rigid stiffness, because the detachment mechanism requires ATP and there is none. Resolution comes 15 to 25 hours later as lysosomal enzymes autolytically digest the contractile proteins faster at higher ambient temperatures. Forensic physicians use the degree of rigor, the body temperature, and the ambient temperature to estimate time of death. They are tracking the kinetics of ATP depletion and proteolysis, which are temperature-sensitive enzyme-mediated processes. You've just learned the molecular basis of forensic medicine.
You can tell the master I'm done for the day.
And so we come to the end of this episode of Tractus Maximus. From the sarcomere to the bedside, from the cross-bridge cycle to the EMG screen, you have now the mechanistic framework that connects every level of the neuromuscular system to specific diseases and specific clinical findings. The troponin on your cardiac assay is the same regulatory protein we just traced through the contraction cycle. The decremental response in myasthenia gravis is the neuromuscular junction safety factor failing in slow motion. Rigor mortis is step 4 of the cross-bridge cycle without step 5. Nothing in clinical neurology is arbitrary. It all traces back to physiology. Join me in the next episode where we shall explore the architecture of the neuromuscular junction. I'm your host, David Ajibe. See you in the next episode.